Hey there everyone, Bianca Raby here, and today I'm excited to bring you a captivating interview with Sara Stevick. Sara's got an incredible journey to share, going from being a teacher to diving headfirst into the world of learning and development. We'll be digging into her story, the challenges she faced, and the wisdom she's gained along the way. And if you're someone thinking about switching careers or just love a good story of transformation, you are in for a treat. Stay tuned for her inspiring story. Hi everyone, I'm super excited to have Sara with me today. Sara Stevick from the States, who is also a fellow teacher who has transitioned. Oh my God, it's possible for more than one of us to do it, which is exciting. So when I read Sara's bio, I said we have to talk, especially being on opposite sides of the planet, but also very, very similar in our careers. So over to you, Sara, to do a bit of an introduction to the audience here and the Bianca Raby brand.
Well, thank you, Bianca. Hi, everyone. I'm Sara Stevick. As Bianca mentioned, I was once a teacher, and I did that for 9 years. Started off in deaf education, moved over into general education. I taught over 11 different subjects in that time, mostly focusing on the sciences, but did a little English and a couple other random things
Were you
as well.
secondary or primary?
Secondary. Definitely love younger children. They're wonderful. I really like the age where, for teaching, where they're able to have a little bit higher critical thinking. They're able to really tap into their own perceptions and belief systems and synthesizing the information from their classes and how that fits within what they perceive the world to be. And so really went more of the high school, secondary education route. And then in 2019, I had a health incident. I actually got a giant cell tumor of bone, which, it sucked. Wish I'd won the lottery with 1 in a million odds of getting it. But
yeah,
to me, I actually kind of feel like I did win, which sounds really odd when you're talking about a tumor.
Mm-hmm.
Thankfully, it wasn't cancerous, but it did require me being off of work. So I started the school year.
Mm-hmm.
I was there for 6 weeks, and then from October until February was out getting surgeries, trying to get back through rehabilitation, all that stuff. And when you go through something like that and you get back to a place where your physical health is at risk, I had quite a rough population. I had just started a new job at inner city school, and I had quite a rough population of kiddos who had just gone through 5 months with a stranger after meeting a stranger. And then transitioned again. So there's just a lot going on. And so mentally, physically, emotionally, I was done. I didn't have a lot of support from my administration aside from if I wanted to leave.
Okay.
And so that was very odd for me, because prior to that, I had worked in a school district that was very supportive. That I could have retired from. So it's all about where you work, what you're willing to accept for your life, or where you're at in your life. And for me at that point, I was a new mom, and I'd just gone through some traumatic surgeries, and I didn't need more trauma coming from work. So I left. I had no idea what I was going to do. All of my resources had been eaten up by the fact that I was just on what we call family medical leave. And I was broke. I didn't know what to do. So it was a huge identity crisis. And so, I just started poking around online, and I stumbled across instructional design. I'm like, what's this? Because they never tell you about that, right?
No, of course they don't tell you about that. You're like, what are these words that you put together? It sounds cool.
And then you start reading about it. Oh, you design learning, you make learning experiences. I do that. I can do that.
Yeah.
And it's true. Teachers do that.
They just call them lesson plans, but they're the same thing.
They're very similar. They're very similar in that you're creating a learning experience. You're putting in all the elements that it takes to make an effective learning. There's a lot of nuances that are different. And I spent quite a bit of time delving into that. So I woke up, and every day that was my job, was learning about what it means to be an instructional designer, building up my skill set, finding the correlations. Because what I really learned was if I wanted a job in a different industry, I had to be able to communicate my experience in a way that resonated with the industry that I was heading toward, not coming from.
Yeah. Very good advice. I think that's going to be one of our captions for this one. Very good advice. I can see that already being pulled out as a caption.
For more of Bianca's thoughts on the barriers for teachers, check out this video.
And it's true. It's very, very much so. I think that's a frustration that as humans, when we aim to communicate, is I'm saying this, but you're not, I don't feel like you're hearing me.
Yeah. I had years of feeling like that, going, why can't they, I feel like I'm like, they're not hearing me. I can't seem to get my message across, but it's all because I didn't know the language yet of how I was supposed to speak to them.
Exactly. And so that takes time. And it's very much so also related to business acumen and developing business acumen for the industry that you're looking to go into, which can be challenging when you're on the outside of the business.
Yeah. And also as a teacher, I'm assuming you went from school to go to university or college to be a teacher, to go back to school. So you don't actually have a lot of business acumen as a teacher naturally, because you're in a institution, not a business. And although in some instances your district may work more like a business, and some places, where people are teaching maybe have more of a business philosophy, but you're still in an education institution.
Well, and I think that's also something that teachers, we don't get a lot of exposure to, is the fact that education is a business. Yes. And it always has been, and it always will be. But the part of the business that we interacted with very much so relied on our humanity and our ability to provide from an intrinsic place. They didn't necessarily want us exposed to the business piece of it, because you do things differently when you're exposed to business. But that's all to say, upskilled for, in my instance, it was 4 months. The pandemic had just taken off, remote learning. Everybody was moving into the remote workspace. And I did land a position as a senior instructional designer with a major financial institution, and worked there for 1.5 years in the audit department. I learned a lot. I made a lot of mistakes. I approached a lot of things with an education mindset at first that retrospectively would have done different, but also I was in a place that nurtured learning, that everybody brought their full selves to work so that I could learn from them and from their business acumen. So for those looking to transition out and find something new, that's something I highly encourage, is find a soft place to land. Find a place where you can learn and make mistakes and just soak it all up,
How'd you go about finding that first position? So how many jobs did you have to apply for to get that foot in the door?
So, oh gosh, this is a hard question, because I applied for a lot of jobs. I'd say probably upwards of 50 or 60 before I realized I needed to change my application documents.
Right.
Once I realized I needed to change my application documents, because I understood more about the industry, I understood, I was learning new things. I learned how to rephrase things. Then I'd say I applied to about 30 to 40 more jobs. And it takes a while. Like, that's very different from the education world. It takes a while to get an interview. And then all the interviews flood in at once, right? So and then it's juggling that and juggling the projects that you're asked to do and thinking about, what am I willing to do for a job? And, with all that, it took me, I left in February, started my role beginning of July.
Okay.
So now the market is very different now. When I did that, I didn't have, there weren't a whole lot of layoffs from learning design professionals. I was coming in on very kind of even footing, that everybody was getting used to remote work. And what did that mean? And what did that mean for the learning space? Now that's established and old hat. So, there's been a lot of layoffs. There's a lot of really talented individuals out looking for work who have experience within the industries that a lot of teachers are looking to transition to. And so if I were to do it now, I would really find my niche. I'd really find what makes me different and be able to articulate that very well.
Check out this video for Bianca's interview tips.
Would you niche in a particular software or a particular skill set within the ID space?
So I think, it depends on what you want to do in the learning and development landscape. If you want to be a content developer and you're focusing just on the build, not really the design of the learning or the strategy, that type of stuff, then I would say pick a software and be very solid in your building. So think about what makes something effective in your learning, and that's not clicking next. So being creative within that software, showing that you're versatile. Now, if you want to be in instructional design, I would say pick kind of like a topic or an industry to focus in on. Do you want to go retail? Do you want to go higher ed? Do you want to go pharma? There's so many different industries that you can go to, but you got to find something to stand out nowadays. And I think a good way to do that is to interview other instructional designers or interview others who currently have the position you want and ask them how they stand out. How do they go about making themselves different than everybody else? Because everybody's going to have articulate storyline experience. Everyone's going to know about Sam, Addie. So why you? Why hire you? And it's not impossible. You just have to be creative.
Yeah, and that's a really, really good advice. And I think one of the things I've spoken about on the channel is around building a portfolio and getting out there and volunteering your time to help build things for people so that you start to get those samples. Because as soon as you go in and work as a contractor, you can't use those samples because you're stealing intellectual property issues, right?
Unless you've put a clause in your agreement. And that's something, if you are looking to volunteer, it's always good to ask, would I be able to use this on my portfolio? And if not, is there a potential to use a redacted version?
Exactly. Yeah. So getting that up front and going to people that maybe, looking to create something and just getting a feel for the way that it works. And also, I think one of the things we spoke about before we turned the camera on is that we spoke about the realities of the job coming from a school. And I think one of the biggest things is that a school has a very set structure of the day. And this job, it has things that you need to do, but it's kind of all on you. That was the first thing I realized. It's like, it's all on me to manage myself and what needs to get done. There's nobody else except for the client. And obviously the deadlines in which you've set with the client or whatever it is. But each day is really kind of a blank slate for you to get the thing done. And one of my superpowers has always been able to see the end product. And I'm assuming you might be someone like that as well, Sarah, where you can see what it is you're building, which keeps you on track. But that takes time.
For some realities of L&D jobs, check out Bianca's top 3 things she thinks they don't tell you.
And I think as teachers, we do that a lot too. We think about our kiddos and, okay, I have to teach this unit before I teach that unit, and they have to know X, Y, and Z before this. So that skill is there. I think you're right. In this landscape, it's being able to communicate and articulate what that process of getting there looks like, especially for your manager, or if you're freelancing your client, you're able to say, this is my plan of attack. So I highly recommend project management, learning a little bit about project management. LinkedIn Learning has a lot of great free courses. You can go on Udemy, you can, lots of YouTube content out there, but learn about project management, learn about the tools that they use. So templates, processes, those types of things, because you will have to manage your time and you'll have to be able to say, this is what I did. Now, if you are like me in education and kind of worried about admin or whoever breathing down your neck saying, well, where's your lesson plan? What are you doing for the next year? How do you know that's successful? That all kind of maintains. So you have that base skill. It's just formalizing it in this new way that speaks to the industry you want to go into.
And that's also back to your point about the terminology. So a lot of the things that you will pick up if you do like an agile project management course is you'll just get a bunch of new terms, but you kind of been doing that anyway. You just never called it that, or, you just had sticky notes on your table, which is kind of like a Kanban board, but you just didn't put it in the columns. You're like, oh, it's called a Kanban board. Great. I love that. Right. So you sort of just get a vocabulary, I think, for some of the behaviors. And I think that's why I've been saying from the very beginning that teachers will make the best L&D people, because they already have this kind of, like, you've know, there's a bunch of core skills that teachers have by nature of being trained as teachers and having that experience in the classroom. That does transfer over, but it's the terminology and it's the new vocab and it's the new remote worky thing or the very heavy laptop time. It's not as, it's not as face-to-face, right?
Yeah, and I think too, it's very much so how you're applying these concepts and thinking about your audience and thinking about who you're working with, because that is very different. It's kind of the difference between baking a traditional sponge cake and baking a cheesecake. They're both cakes, but the way that you bake them and go about cooking them so that they have the texture and consistency that you're aiming for are very different.
Yeah.
So for me, I think what I always encourage anyone that I talk to who's looking at transitioning and going into this space is you need to have confidence in the skills that you bring, but not so much confidence that you don't recognize how much there is to learn. And that's really important because new transitioners are like, this is it. I'm leaving teaching. I'm going to apply. Mm-hmm. They use their teacher resume, they apply, and then they never hear back, or the feedback that they get if they do get an interview is that you're not ready. Mm-hmm. And this is what we were again talking about, is that language and saying, oh, I can do this. I can do this. I just need someone to take a chance on me. Mm-hmm. It's shifting that mindset to what can I give for you in order for you to take the risk on me, and communicating that in a way that resonates and uses the terms that the hiring manager is going to use. Because teachers coming in saying, well, I'm a teacher, so I have all the skill sets already, that lets the hiring manager know that you are not ready.
Yeah, exactly.
So upskilling is important.
For more on project management in e-learning, check out this video.
Very much. Sure. And both of us have done some interesting stuff around building. You built a beautiful community. Maybe just as we wrap this up, maybe just talk a bit about the community that you built and any of the highlights from that experience of talking, directly to teachers that are trying to move out.
Yeah, sure. So I founded Teaching a Path to L&D. We are on LinkedIn. We're on YouTube. We're not on Facebook. We're not as active as we once were, but I think that's something else that you tend to find the further out you get from your transition is initially you really latch on to a lot of things that you know how to do and you want to support others. And I'm still in that space. I want to support others, but I'm still learning and I'm still growing. And so now I'm really excited about the theory and how to apply that in new ways and to think creatively outside of the box. Within the landscape that I'm in. And so the more I get away from my transition, the less I have ties back to that experience of being a teacher in ways that I find were super beneficial initially. Like transitioning now is different from when I transitioned. So I think there's a lot of people in the space. I'm happy to have a conversation, help whoever, and talk about my experience. And I have learned a lot. And I think those who have just transitioned too have a lot to offer in that space as well. So, if you're looking to transition, definitely talk to those who had transitioned 20 years ago, talk to people 5 years ago, talk to people last month. It's a journey. It's not just something that happens overnight.
No, and I think that's a very important message to end on, I think, is that it isn't a quick fix. There is lots of there's lots of content out there. You produce it, I produce it, and there's heaps of us producing content, but it doesn't just happen. And my moment was like I accidentally was like, oh, I think I'm doing this role that people call instructional design. So, I don't know. I started a new job. I said, what do you think I should be called? And they're like, well, I call myself this. And I go, a instructional designer. I said, I don't know. Should I? And I just Googled it. And I was like, oh, that sounds a little bit like I think that's what I'm doing in this job. So, it was a bit accidental on my behalf, but that was because we still were not figuring out what this was. Like there was still not a really big conversation about especially in the higher education sense. Maybe in corporates they were talking about L&D, and instructional design was a term that everybody used, and that was fine. But in higher ed, no one had really said that yet when I started. So it was almost like crafting the role itself, which is very different.
Well, and that's the thing. And I think that's something that, coming from teaching, which has such a structured definition around it, a role that's been established for centuries as a teacher, and learning and development. So learning and development is the umbrella.
Yeah.
It's like what all of these learning professional roles fall under is learning and development. I think that's an important distinction to make, because sometimes coming in, that can be a little confusing. And so when we think about a learning and development professional, that could be an instructional designer, content developer. It could be curriculum specialist, a learning specialist, a learning strategist. There's so many different things, and those things are layered in levels. And so coming from education, even though we know a lot, there's still a lot to learn about the industry that you're going into. So be realistic about the level of role that you might be offered, even if you have a PhD. And if you've been a teacher for 20 years, you might start out as an entry-level instructional designer or content developer, and then you start to learn what it means to be in this landscape of learning and development, and you can pivot from there. It's very different than teaching. You don't stay in a role for a long period of time, make advancements, to be quite frank.
And I think back to that is a specialty will find you if you're open to that. I think it was a great point to make about the specialty, but not to worry too much about it. Get in, start, and you'll gravitate to it. You'll know very quickly what part of the process is your superpower.
And the best indicator for what you'll be doing on a job is the job description contents, not the title.
Yeah.
And whatever the hiring manager says, because oftentimes they'll copy and paste job descriptions that they found elsewhere. And then you get into the role and you find yourself doing something a little bit different.
Yeah. Find out what the day in the life of this job would actually be. I think that's important too. Thank you so much, Sara. That was such a good conversation. It was great to hear your journey, and that, obviously sad to hear how you had to transition, but at the same time, you made the most of a difficult situation, and it's got you to completely different places. So well done.
Thank you so much, Bianca. This is great.
And until next time, stay awesome.